A 9-year-old boy walks to school alone for the first time. 6 blocks, less than half a mile. It should have taken 10 minutes. He never arrived. For 58 years, his killer watched from a window just 6 blocks away, staring directly at the cemetery where the child was buried, living freely while a family prayed every Sunday for answers that forensic science couldn't yet provide. This is the story of how a single DNA molecule, preserved on a jacket in 1964, would travel through 6 decades of technological evolution to expose a predator who thought he'd escaped into history. The odds of the final match? 1 in 480 septillion. This is a case of Thomas Hernandez. Welcome to Cold Case Grim Files. I'm your host, and today we're examining one of the most significant forensic breakthroughs in American criminal justice history. Before we continue, I need to ask something important. If this story matters to you, if you believe these forgotten voices deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button and like this video right now. Every subscription helps us bring these cases to light and ensures that victims like Thomas are never truly forgotten. Your support keeps this work alive. Thank you. The numbers behind this case are staggering. 58 years of investigation, 230-plus different investigators, 5,000 pages of case files, thousands of leads pursued, 1 wrongful conviction that lasted a decade, and finally, a 1 in 480 septillion DNA match. This case became the 4th oldest cold case in United States history solved through forensic genetic genealogy, and the oldest in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. But before it became a landmark achievement in criminal justice, before it represented the fusion of cutting-edge science and old-fashioned detective work, it began as something far simpler and far more heartbreaking. It began with a child who wanted to give his teacher a gift. Long before Thomas Hernandez became a name in a case file, he was simply a child growing up in a home built on love, faith, and unwavering tradition. Thomas was born on Thanksgiving Day, November 25, 1954, in Waterloo, New York. He was the second of 5 children born to Carmen and Mary Hernandez. The family was working class, deeply rooted in close-knit values that place faith and family at the absolute center of everyday life. His father, Carmen, had ties to Wilkes-Barre, while his mother, Mary, came from Hazleton, Pennsylvania. After several years in New York, the Hernandez family made the decision to return to Mary's hometown in the early 1960s, settling once again in the coal region that would come to define and ultimately devastate their lives. Hazleton in 1964 was a community still deeply defined by its coal mining heritage. Situated in the heart of the Andesite region, it was a city where generations of families had built their lives around the rhythmic, grueling cycles of the mines. Although the industry had begun its slow decline, the Knox mine disaster in 1959 had rung the death knell. The culture of the mines had forged remained ironclad. This was a place where neighbors were as close as kin, where children walked to school without the slightest shadow of fear, where the Catholic Church served as the undisputed backbone of social and moral life. In 1964, the concept of stranger danger was virtually non-existent. Parents felt secure allowing their children to roam freely, to play unsupervised, to navigate their small world with confidence. That very innocence, the innocence that allowed children like Thomas to move through their days without fear, was about to be shattered by an act of evil that would fundamentally alter the community's understanding of safety. The Hernandez family settled into the northwest section of the city. There, Carmen operated the Little Market, a neighborhood grocery store located directly next to their home on Alter Street. The work was demanding and relentless. Carmen would rise before the sun to pick up supplies and tend to customers from 10 a.m. until 10 p.m. 7 days a week. When the doors finally closed, he spent his late-night hours handling the bookkeeping. Mary, meanwhile, contributed to the family's modest income by working at one of the downtown knitting mills, joining the ranks of local women who powered an economy transitioning away from its industrial past. Despite the long hours their parents worked, the Hernandez children lived a childhood defined by love and tradition. Sundays were held as sacred. Carmen would close the little market for exactly 1 hour around lunchtime, the only time during the entire week when the family sat together around the table. These mornings began with Mass at either St. Joseph's or Most Precious Blood Church, reinforcing the deep Catholic faith that guided their lives. For young Thomas, faith was more than a family obligation. It was a profound personal calling. A gentle child with bright blue eyes and dark hair, he was known for his selfless nature. He frequently told his family that he intended to become a priest when he grew up, a dream that felt entirely consistent with his character. He was the type of boy who instinctively put others first, finding joy in simple pleasures like playing school with his siblings or tinkering on the organ his parents had purchased for him from Sears. In the evenings, the house was often filled with music as Thomas sat at the organ, composing songs with his older brother, Ronald. Thomas shared a bedroom with his younger sister, Carmen Marie, whom he affectionately nicknamed Dune. At night, the two would talk quietly about their dreams, Thomas's aspirations for priesthood, Carmen's hopes for the future. Their room was decorated with posters of 1960s icons like David Cassidy and Ricky Nelson, markers of an era of profound innocence. The daily routine was as predictable as it was comforting. Carmen would be at the store before dawn. Mary would head to the mill, and the children would walk together to St. Joseph's Parochial School, where nuns in traditional habits provided an education steeped in Catholic values. In Hazleton, everyone knew everyone. The most shocking news in the neighborhood usually concerned the quality of a neighbor's tomato garden or the success of a church fundraiser. Beneath this veneer of small-town safety, however, a darkness was beginning to stir, a darkness that would consume Thomas Hernandez and haunt Hazleton for nearly 6 decades. Wednesday, March 18, 1964, began with the same familiar rhythm. At 4:30 a.m., the alarm clock broke the morning silence. Thomas rolled over into bed he shared with Carmen Marie and whispered a characteristically thoughtful request. "Close your eyes, Dune," he said softly. "I'm going to turn on the light to get my clothes." It was a small act of consideration, yet it would become one of his sister's most cherished memories, replayed endlessly in the decades that followed. Thomas carefully selected his outfit for the day, a dark jacket and pants, black socks, and a multicolored scarf. He put on his watch, slipped a silver ring with a small diamond onto his finger, and fastened a yellow gold necklace with a 1-inch cross around his neck. Thomas had a special mission that morning. One of the nuns at St. Joseph's was celebrating a feast day, and Thomas wanted to honor her with a gift. He went into his father's grocery store and carefully selected 2 cans of fruit, a small, thoughtful gesture that perfectly captured his nature. Because he wanted to drop the cans off in his classroom before attending daily Mass, Thomas made an uncharacteristic request of his parents that morning. He wanted to walk to school alone. Under normal circumstances, Thomas always made the 6-block walk to St. Joseph's Parochial School with his brothers and sisters. The school was less than half a mile away, but he had never made the journey by himself. That morning, he was driven by a simple purpose. He wanted to arrive early enough to leave the canned pears and beets for Sister Josephine and still be seated in time for Mass at St. Joseph's Church. His parents considered the request and eventually agreed. Between 7:50 and 8 a.m., Thomas gathered his belongings, his school bag, his small wallet, and the heavy canned goods, and wrapped a multicolored scarf around his head to shield himself from the biting wind. Dressed in a dark jacket and pants, black socks, and suede shoes, he stepped out of the warmth of 533, Alta Street, and into the cold morning air. It was the last time his family would see him alive. The wind that morning was relentless, a fierce, gusty force that buffeted Thomas's small frame as he navigated the northern sidewalk. At approximately 8:10 a.m., he reached the vicinity of 212 West 4th Street, near an area known as Sherman Court. It was here that he was spotted by Helen Slattery, his mother's cousin. Helen watched from a window as the little boy hustled eastward, his head tucked against the gale, clutching his school bag and his offerings for Sister Josephine. Thomas was only a single block west of Church Street, a thoroughfare the locals referred to as Route 309, and he seemed entirely consumed by his mission. The cold was so severe that Helen Slattery briefly considered opening her door to call Thomas inside, hoping to offer the child a few moments of warmth before he continued. She was not the only one who noticed a lone figure struggling against elements. Several other neighbors observed Thomas that morning. Some even offered him shelter. Each time, Thomas declined. He was a child defined by a sense of duty, and his internal clock was set to the start of morning Massachusetts. He could not afford to be late. He pressed on, disappearing from the view of the neighborhood witnesses as he approached the final blocks towards St. Joseph's. He would never arrive. As the morning progressed, the silence where Thomas should have been began to echo. At St. Joseph's Parochial School, his seat remained empty. His teacher, noting the absence, marked her records accordingly. Through the first hour and then the second, the assumption remained that the bitter weather had perhaps kept the young boy at home, or that a sudden illness had intervened. No phone call was made to the Hernandez household. In 1964, the absence of a student was a matter that usually waited until the end of the day or the arrival of a parent's note. The true gravity of the situation did not materialize until the lunch hour. It was the custom of the Hernandez children to walk home for their midday meal, a brief return to warmth and family, before heading back for the afternoon session at school. When the door to 533 Alter Street opened, Ronald, the eldest of the children, and Carmen Marie stepped inside. But Thomas was not with them. Carmen Hernandez looked past his two children, instinctively expecting to see Thomas's dark hair and his multicolored scarf appear on the sidewalk just behind them, as it always did. Instead, there was nothing. The street outside remained still and empty. When he asked where Thomas was, the children could offer no explanation. They hadn't seen him at school that morning. Carmen clung to hope that this was nothing more than a simple misunderstanding. He told them to finish their lunch and return to St. Joseph's immediately. Perhaps, he suggested, Thomas had stayed behind for an activity or had simply lost track of time while praying in the chapel. Following her father's instructions, Carmen Marie went straight to Thomas's homeroom teacher as soon as she arrived back at the school. The response was immediate and chilling. The teacher confirmed what the attendance records already showed. Thomas had never arrived that morning. He had been marked absent since the start of the school day. The realization hit the family with the force of a physical blow. Something had gone terribly wrong. Carmen Hernandez did not wait for further information. He began an immediate, frantic search of the neighborhood. He retraced the route Thomas should have taken, his eyes scanning every alleyway, every porch, every storefront. He went to St. Joseph's Church, searching the pews and the quiet corners of the sanctuary. He began knocking on doors, asking neighbors if they had seen a 9-year-old boy in a dark jacket. The search was interrupted when one of the neighborhood women called out to him. She had seen the desperation in his face and heard him calling his son's name. When Carmen confirmed who he was looking for, the woman's expression shifted from curiosity to a visible, shaking dread. "If you're looking for the little boy," she told him, her voice barely a whisper, "they found him." The location was not on the route to school, nor was it anywhere within the familiar confines of the neighborhood. Approximately 3 miles away from the Hernandez home, in Hazleton Township, lay an abandoned coal stripping pit. It was a jagged scar on the landscape, a remnant of the region's anthracite mining past that had since devolved into an illegal dumping ground for refuse. Tucked away near the Hazleton Municipal Airport, off Airport Road. The pit was a place of gray earth and discarded waste. It was isolated, hidden from view, and rarely visited except by those looking to dispose of unwanted items. Just after 1 p.m., a man arrived in the area to give his 16-year-old nephew a driving lesson. He had chosen these quiet back roads specifically to allow the nervous teenager practice without the pressure of traffic as the boy navigated the rugged terrain. Something caught their attention in one of the old mining pits. At first glance, it appeared to be a large doll, discarded among the trash, a splash of color contrasting sharply against the dark, churned earth. Curiosity gave way to a sickening dread. The man stopped the car and approached the edge of the pit. There, lying among the debris of the abandoned coal stripping, was not a doll. It was a child. The man reached out and, to his horror, the small body was still warm to the touch. Realizing what he had found, he ran back to his car and immediately contacted the Pennsylvania State Police. Within minutes, the quiet of the dumping ground was shattered by the arrival of investigators and patrol cars. Following the customs of the time, priests from St. Joseph's Church also arrived at the scene to administer last rites. When one of the clergymen looked down at the small, still form at the bottom of the pit, his face went pale. He recognized him instantly, to the heartbreak of the community and the ruin of the Hernandez family. He positively identified the body as Thomas Hernandez. The scene at the base of the stripping pit was a stark and harrowing contrast to the domestic warmth Thomas had left only hours earlier. As investigators descended the slope, they found a 9-year-old lying among the discarded refuse. His small body a focal point of absolute tragedy. He remained fully clothed in the dark jacket and pants he had chosen for school, but his feet were bare. His suede shoes had been removed and were discovered a short distance away, discarded near the other remnants of his morning journey. Strewn about the gray earth were the items that represented his final mundane errands. His school bag, his small wallet, and the 2 tins of food he had so carefully selected from his father's market. The pears and the beets, intended as a simple gesture of kindness for one of the nuns at his school, now sat as silent witnesses in the dirt. The brutality of his final moments was written in the way he had been restrained. His wrists had been bound together tightly, and his ankles were similarly secured. The ligatures used were his own shoelaces, stripped from his suede shoes to serve as makeshift cords. To ensure his silence, the killer had taken his multicolored scarf. The scarf meant to protect him from the wind, and used it as a gag. It had been forced so deep into his mouth and throat that the violence of the act had knocked out one of his teeth. The physical evidence on his body told a story of a struggle that was as brief as it was violent. He had been struck twice on the crown of his head, and once on his right temple, blows likely intended to incapacitate him. Around his neck, the unmistakable marks of manual pressure were visible. The following day, an autopsy conducted at Hazleton State General Hospital provided clinical confirmation of the crime's brutality. The examination revealed that Thomas had been subjected to sexual assault prior to his death. The official cause of death was recorded as asphyxiation and strangulation. Thomas Hernandez had been choked to death in the isolated quiet of the stripping pit. However, amid the horror, the killer had inadvertently left behind a singular piece of evidence that the science of 1964 was unequipped to understand. Traces of the perpetrator's bodily fluids were discovered on Thomas's dark jacket. At the time, the field of forensic genetics was non-existent. Though James Watson and Francis Crick had modeled the double helix structure of DNA only 11 years earlier, in 1953, the idea that a person's biological blueprint could be used to identify them in a criminal investigation remained a province of science fiction. To investigators in 1964, the stains were simply a grim detail to be documented. They could determine a basic blood type, A, B, AB, or O, but they could not isolate a specific individual from a population of millions. That evidence would sit in storage, carefully preserved, waiting for science to catch up. It would wait for 58 years. As the news of the murder rippled through Hazleton, the town's identity began to fracture. This was a community built by waves of immigrants, Germans and Irish in the 1840s, followed by Italians, Poles, Russians, Lithuanians, Slovaks, and Montenegrins who had arrived to toil in the mines. By 1964, the coal industry was in terminal decline, but the community spirit had remained resilient. Hazleton was still a place where children played outside until the streetlights flickered to life, and where the idea of a child walking 6 blocks to school alone was considered a mundane part growing up. The day after the discovery, Hazleton Mayor Joseph Conahan, a man who lived 1 block from Alter Street and whose own children were playmates of the Hernandez siblings, issued a somber statement to the public. He declared that the crime had made everyone cognizant of the constant presence of evil and reality, that heinous murders could happen even in their own backyard. The funeral was an event of staggering proportions. The lines of mourners at the viewing stretched far beyond the doors of the funeral home, a testament to a town in collective grief. When the time came to close the casket, Mary Hernandez leaned over her son for one final farewell kiss. It was a moment of profound finality, the beginning of a life sentence of what-ifs for the family. Thomas was interred in St. Joseph's Slovak Roman Catholic Cemetery, leaving his parents and 4 siblings to face a world that now felt fundamentally more dangerous than it had just the morning before. Early in the investigation, police looked beyond the borders of Hazleton, investigating a potential link to the 1962 murder of 9-year-old Carol Doherty in Bristol, Pennsylvania. Carol had been found strangled in the choir loft of St. Mark's Roman Catholic Church, and on the night before Thomas's death, approximately 1,000 people from Bristol had been in Hazleton for a high school basketball playoff game. Despite the chilling similarities, both victims were 9 years old. Both were Catholic school students. Both were strangled. No connection could be established. This new lead, however, only served to intensify the pressure on the Pennsylvania State Police. With the 1962 murder of Carol Doherty still lingering as a painful and unresolved failure, the department felt an urgent need to show progress. 2 high-profile child murders within a span of just 2 years threatened public confidence, and the demand for answers was mounting. That pressure soon began to focus on a man who lived on the margins of town, Walter Kowalski. Walter Kowalski was a 52-year-old former coal miner who lived in near-total isolation. His home was a small, weather-beaten wooden shack, crudely assembled and tucked away on neglected land approximately 1,300 feet from the abandoned coal stripping pit where Thomas's body had been found. For decades, Walter had worked deep underground in the anthracite mines that once sustained Hazleton. But as the mines closed and his health deteriorated, steady employment became impossible. Unable to perform heavy labor, he survived by collecting scrap metal and discarded items from the streets and alleyways, trading what he found for small amount of cash. To local authorities, his proximity to the crime scene, his solitary existence, and his constant movement through the neighborhood made him an immediate person of interest. In the days following the murder, investigators paid a visit to Walter's shack in rural Pennsylvania in 1964. The legal protections of the Fourth Amendment were often applied unevenly, especially to those living on society's fringes. The officers did not seek a warrant. They did not ask for permission. In their view, the shack was not a legal residence in conventional sense, but temporary structure erected on land believed to be public. With that assumption, they stepped inside the cramped, dimly lit space, their uniforms filling the small room as Walter stood quietly by. When questioned about his whereabouts on the morning of Wednesday, March 18th, Walter answered plainly and without defensiveness. He admitted that he had gone toward the areas of the stripping pit that morning, as he often did while searching for scrap. But he explained he had only gone a short distance before feeling unwell. The cold had gotten to him that morning, and with his health already poor, he began to feel unsteady. He turned back and spent the remainder of the day resting inside his shack. As one officer continued asking questions, another let his eyes wander around the interior of the room. The space was cluttered with rusted tools, coils of wire, and bits of salvaged metal stacked against the walls. Then something caught his attention. Hanging from a rough wooden post near the center of the shack was a small yellow gold necklace, its cross pendant catching what little light filtered to the narrow window. "This necklace looks like it's worth as much as your faith, doesn't it?" the officer remarked, his tone edged with casual mockery. Walter followed the officer's gaze and nodded without hesitation. "I found that necklace near the coal pit on Wednesday morning," he said simply. "Someone must have dropped it." The officers exchanged no visible reaction. One of them made a brief note in his pad. They asked no further questions about the necklace. After a few more minutes, they thanked Walter for his time and left the shack as quietly as they had entered. Later that day, investigators contacted Carmen and Mary Hernandez. They asked a single, pointed question. Had their son owned a gold necklace with a cross? Carmen did not need time to think. Just 3 months earlier, he explained, he had bought Thomas a yellow gold chain with a 1-inch cross for his 9th birthday. It had quickly become his most treasured possession. He wore it every day, to school, to church, and on the morning he disappeared. With that confirmation, the direction of the investigation shifted decisively. That evening, police returned to the shack on the edge of town. This time, they did not come with questions. Walter Kowalski was taken into custody. To strengthen their case, investigators produced a witness who claimed to have seen Walter near Airport Road around the time of the murder. The sighting was vague and imprecise, but it was enough. A formal indictment soon followed. In 1964, the American legal system was in the midst of transition. Although the Supreme Court had ruled in Gideon versus Wainwright the year before, guaranteeing the right to counsel for indigent defendants, the reality in rural jurisdictions lagged far behind the law on paper. Walter was never advised of a right to remain silent. The Miranda decision was still 2 years away. He was questioned aggressively, without an attorney present, by men who already believed they had found their culprit. To the Pennsylvania State Police, Walter represented a resolution to an escalating crisis, a way to reassure a frightened public and to finally close the shadow cast by the Doherty case. There was no confession. There was no forensic evidence linking Walter to the act of murder itself. But the gold necklace and the eyewitness testimony proved persuasive. A jury returned a guilty verdict. Walter Kowalski was convicted of the murder of Thomas Hernandez and sentenced to life in prison. The conviction did not bring the peace the authorities had hoped for. A small group of neighbors who had known Walter for years openly questioned the verdict. They argued that the state had targeted a poor, uneducated man of Polish descent, someone without the means or knowledge to defend himself properly. To them, the case rested on circumstantial evidence, inflated by fear and public pressure. For 10 years, Walter Kowalski remained behind bars while the truth remained buried. The case of Thomas Hernandez was considered closed until 1974, when a newly appointed district attorney reviewed the aging files. The conclusion was unavoidable. There was no direct evidence tying Walter to the murder, only possession of a necklace he claimed to have found. The conviction was vacated. Walter Kowalski was released from prison, a man irrevocably altered by a decade of wrongful incarceration. After receiving an out-of-court settlement from the state, he quietly left Hazleton and disappeared into obscurity. With his departure, the illusion of closure collapsed. The shadow of the crime returned, and the investigation into the murder of the boy from Alter Street was once again forced back to beginning, unsolved, unanswered, and unresolved. Throughout the decade that followed, the search for answers never truly stopped. Over time, the names of more than 230 members of the Pennsylvania State Police would appear in the case files. Year after year, investigators continue to review the evidence, and Hernandez family continued to contact police, hoping for any updates on Thomas's case. Inside the Hernandez home, grief became a permanent resident. Mary Hernandez, Thomas's mother, turned her sorrow into quiet devotion, preserving every letter and every sympathy card that arrived in the aftermath of her son's murder. Her eldest son, Ronald, later recalled that for nearly 50 years, every Sunday dinner and every holiday meal ended the same way. When grace was said, his mother would always include a final, unwavering prayer. Lord, please watch over Thomas's soul. Please guide him safely into heaven. And please help the police find the person who did this. The breakthrough they had waited for finally arrived in 2007, 43 years after murder, when science finally caught up to the evidence preserved on Thomas's jacket. The Pennsylvania State Police DNA Laboratory successfully developed a suspect DNA profile from the biological fluids that had been carefully documented in 1964. Investigators immediately ran the profile against every original suspect from the 1964 files. One by one, the men who had occupied their suspicion for decades were eliminated. The profile was then entered into CODIS, the National Database of Convicted Offenders and Arrestees. For over 12 years, from 2007 through 2019, the system automatically checked the killer's DNA against every new entry in the database every month. Year after year, the result was the same. No match. The killer, it seemed, had either never been arrested for a qualifying crime or had managed to vanish from the system entirely. The investigation hit a wall of digital silence, and the case of the boy from Alter Street threatened to go cold for good. In her later years, as the investigation remained stalled and answers continued to elude the family, Mary Hernandez reached a state of profound spiritual grace. She told her children that having Thomas for 9 years had been a blessing, and she eventually voiced forgiveness for the man she had never met. Mary Hernandez died in 2014, 50 years after the crime. She was buried without ever knowing the identity of her son's killer. Her husband, Carmen Hernandez, had died years earlier, leaving Ronald and his siblings to carry the search into a second half-century. In 2018, the Pennsylvania State Police forged a partnership that would finally bridge the gap between 1964 and the present day. They reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based DNA technology firm that specialized in a revolutionary process known as snapshot forensic DNA phenotyping. On March 20th, 2019, the department released a series of composite images created by this technology, visual predictions of a killer who had been invisible for over half a century. The genetic analysis predicted a man of European ancestry with dark brown hair, blue or green eyes, and fair skin with possible freckling. The public was shown 3 versions of this face: how he likely appeared at age 25, age 40, and age 60. While the images sparked public interest, the true breakthrough emerged from a different digital frontier. Around the same time, the killer's DNA profile was uploaded to GeneMatch, a public database where users share genetic data to identify biological relatives. The search returned a match, but it was a distant one, a 6th cousin sharing approximately 53 centimorgans of DNA. It was a single, fragile thread stretching back 6 generations, one that required specialized expertise to follow. That expertise entered the investigation in February 2020 through contact with Pennsylvania State Police Corporal Mark Barron. The outreach came from Eric Schubert, a college freshman at Elizabethtown College. Though still early in his academic career as a history major, Schubert had been immersed in genealogical research since childhood, a passion sparked by his grandmother's adoption. Through his work with Genealogy, he had already assisted law enforcement agencies near Philadelphia and Chicago in resolving cold cases. Barron reviewed Schubert's background, recognized the depth of his experience, and approved his voluntary involvement in the Hernandez case. Schubert began with a list of approximately 2,000 people who shared a common ancestor with the unknown killer. Working up to 20 hours a week from his dorm room, he meticulously constructed family trees, searching for a path that led back to Hazleton. During his research, a specific surname began to emerge. Palmero. The name was already familiar to the Pennsylvania State Police. A woman named Renata Palmero had been shot to death in Carbon County in the 1970s, and the DNA from that unrelated investigation helped confirm Schubert was on the correct ancestral track. As the trees grew, investigators interviewed Palmero relatives and acquired voluntary DNA samples. In 2020, the state police laboratory established a Y chromosome profile for the suspect, narrowing the search strictly to the paternal line. Slowly, the genetic distance closed from a sixth cousin to a half-uncle or first cousin. Eventually, the pool of suspects was winnowed down to just 4 men. Among them was a man named James Paul Forte. Forte had been born on July 21st, 1941, in Hazleton. He was 22 years old at the time of Thomas's murder. A 1959 graduate of Hazleton High School, his yearbook described a tall, blue-eyed, handsome young man who loved baseball and had an undecided future. He had served in the U.S. Army from 1959 until September 1962. After his discharge, he lived a muted, solitary life in Hazleton, working as a bartender and a salesman for bar supplies. He never married. He had no children. As investigators looked into Forte's history, they discovered a geographical proximity that was as chilling as the crime itself. In the years following the murder, Forte had lived at several addresses, 745 and 770 North Laurel Street, and most notably 118 West 14th Street. All of these residences were within 6 or 7 blocks of the Hernandez home on Alter Street. Furthermore, his home on 14th Street sat directly across from the St. Joseph Slovak Roman Catholic Cemetery. For years, James Paul Forte had lived with direct, unobstructed view of the grave where Thomas Hernandez was buried. Investigators also uncovered a disturbing incident from Forte's past that had nearly exposed him years earlier. On April 3, 1974, 10 years after Thomas was killed, Forte met a 23-year-old woman at the Copemont Lounge in Hazleton. He offered to drive her home, but instead diverted to the remote Stockton Mountain Road. There, he attacked and sexually assaulted the woman. The assault was interrupted when a passing truck approached the area, prompting Forte to flee. He later dropped the victim off in downtown Hazleton. Forte was arrested and charged with involuntary deviate sexual intercourse and aggravated assault. However, in a failure of the judicial system that would haunt the investigation, he was allowed to plead guilty only to the aggravated assault charge. On October 2, 1974, Judge Bernard C. Berminski sentenced Forte to a mere 1 year of special probation and ordered him to pay the victim's hospital bills. He never spent a day in prison because DNA testing did not exist in 1974, and because Forte's name had never appeared in the original 1964 files. The connection between the two crimes went unnoticed. Forte continued to live in the community, facing only one other minor arrest for reckless endangerment in 1978. On May 16, 1980, while working as a bartender at Genetti's Best Western Motor Lodge on Route 309, the 38-year-old Forte collapsed. He died of a heart attack before reaching the hospital and was buried in Calvary Cemetery in Drums, Pennsylvania. For 41 years, his secret went with him to the grave, but science was about to reach across 4 decades of silence. By December 2021, the genealogical trail led by Eric Schubert had reached its inevitable conclusion, but the Pennsylvania State Police required a final, definitive confirmation that would stand the test of law. They met with the Luzerne County District Attorney's Office to plot a course that was as rare as it was dramatic. To secure the evidence they needed, they would have to reach across 41 years of silence and bring James Paul Forte out of the earth. On January 6, 2022, exactly 41 years, 7 months, and 21 days after Forte had been interred, investigators executed a search warrant at Calvary Cemetery in Drums, Pennsylvania. The exhumation was a somber, clinical procedure conducted with the assistance of cemetery officials and the district attorney's staff. As the soil was moved, the investigators sought a final biological link to a morning in 1964. A tissue sample was obtained from Forte's remains and rushed to the Pennsylvania State Police DNA laboratory. The results reached the investigators on February 3, 2022. The DNA profile extracted from the cemetery match was compared to the biological stains on the jacket Thomas had worn on the day he died. The laboratory returned a match probability of 1 in 480 septillion. It was a number of such staggering proportions that it transcended mere forensic certainty. In a world that has seen roughly 117 billion human lives, one would have to search for a million planet Earths to find another individual with the same genetic markers. The Y chromosome profile provided the final, echoing confirmation. After 57 years, 10 months, and 16 days, the search for the killer of Thomas Hernandez was over. On the morning of Thursday, February 10th, 2022, the Hazleton Township Commons building was filled with attention that had been building for nearly 6 decades. The press conference was attended by a generational cross-section of the Hazleton community. Current investigators, grieving family members, and retired officials who had begun their careers when the case was fresh. Corporal Mark Barron, the lead investigator who had lived with a 5,000-page case file for years, stood before the microphones. He was visibly shaken, his voice fracturing as he addressed the room. He spoke of the vivid memory the case held for everyone who had grown up in the shadow of the crime, admitting that while officers are cautioned against emotional attachment, the story of the boy from Alter Street had become inseparable from the identity of the department. He noted that the Pennsylvania State Police had been in existence since 1905, meaning they had spent more than half of their entire organizational history investigating this single murder. The Hernandez siblings stood together, Ronald, Carmen Marie, and their younger siblings, the last living witnesses to a family forever shaped by a March morning in 1964. It was Carmen, the younger sister, who spoke first. Her voice was steady as she remembered the sweet and gentle boy who practiced his organ and dreamed of a life devoted to faith. She explained that her parents, Mary and Carmen, had never sought revenge or punishment. They had asked only for the truth. Justice has been served today, she said, marking the moment the promise made to her mother was finally kept. Ronald then addressed the room, speaking of a closure that was never truly complete. He talked about the what-ifs that still lingered at family gatherings, the nieces and nephews Thomas would never have, and a life erased by a man who had lived just 6 blocks away. He thanked the Pennsylvania State Police troopers who had remained connected to the family for decades, forming a bond that endured long after leads grew cold. As the details of Forte's life emerged, so did the realization that Thomas may not have been his only victim. Following the announcement, a woman named Gina Donahue Connors came forward with a memory from the late 1960s, describing a man in a car who had aggressively tried to lure her and a friend into his vehicle at the corner of 3rd and Alter Streets. Upon seeing the photo of James Paul Forte, she was convinced she was looking at the man from that afternoon. Investigators echoed the suspicion, stating that a predator of Forte's nature rarely strikes only once. They issued a public call for anyone with information regarding Forte's activities between 1964 and 1980 to contact the authorities. The resolution of the Thomas Hernandez case marked a historic milestone in the American legal system. It became the 4th oldest cold case in United States history to be solved through forensic genetic genealogy, and the oldest in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It served as definitive proof of the long game of justice, a testament to the 1964 investigators who had the foresight to preserve a stained jacket, and to a 20-year-old student who had the persistence to trace a sixth cousin to the archives of history. The case underscores several critical lessons. The importance of evidence preservation. Without the careful documentation and storage of that jacket in 1964, this case would never have been solved. Every piece of evidence matters, even when current technology cannot analyze it. The danger of tunnel vision. The wrongful conviction of Walter Kowalski serves as a stark reminder of what can happen when investigators focus on a suspect to the exclusion of other possibilities. Pressure to solve high-profile cases can lead to tragic miscarriages of justice. The power of persistence. 230 investigators over 58 years never gave up. The Hernandez family never stopped asking questions. That persistence ultimately made the difference. The revolution of genetic genealogy. This case demonstrated how emerging technologies can breathe new life into decades-old investigations. What was impossible in 1964, 1974, 1984, 1994, and even 2004 became possible in 2022. Hazleton, Pennsylvania, would never truly return to the era of unlocked doors and innocent walks to school. The shadow of March 18, 1964, was too long and too dark for that. The murder of Thomas Hernandez fundamentally changed how the community understood safety, trust, and vulnerability. Parents began walking their children to school. Doors that had never been locked were suddenly bolted. A certain innocence was lost forever. But as the press conference ended and the Hernandez siblings stepped out into the February air, the weight of the unknown had finally been lifted. The miracle Thomas had sought on his way to St. Joseph's Church had arrived at last. Not in 1964, but in the relentless, advancing march of science and the unwavering memory of a town that refused to forget him. The story of Thomas Hernandez is not just about a murder solved or a killer identified. It's about a family that prayed every Sunday for 58 years. It's about a mother who forgave before she knew who to forgive. It's about 230 investigators who refused to let a case file gather dust. It's about a college student who spent countless hours in his dorm room building family trees that would span centuries. Most importantly, it's about a 9-year-old boy who wanted to give his teacher a gift. A simple act of kindness that should have taken 10 minutes, but instead became a 58-year journey to justice. Every year, thousands of cold cases sit in evidence rooms across America. Inside those boxes are families still waiting, still praying, still hoping for answers. Technology is advancing rapidly. Genetic genealogy is solving cases that were once considered impossible, but it requires resources, dedication, and public support. If Thomas's story has moved you, I want to ask you to do something important. First, share this video. Share it with your family, your friends, your community. These stories need to be told, and victims like Thomas deserve to be remembered. Second, if you know someone with information about an unsolved case, anywhere, encourage them to come forward. It's never too late. As this case proves, justice can wait 58 years, but it never has to wait forever. And finally, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. We bring these forgotten stories to light because they matter, because victims matter, because truth matters. The resolution of the Thomas Hernandez case stands as a powerful reminder of what persistence and science can achieve, even across generations. It reflects how far forensic investigation has come and how justice, though delayed, does not always disappear. This case underscores a fragile balance between protecting the rights of the accused and the responsibility to seek truth, especially in crimes that leave lasting scars on a community. Every case we tell carries lessons about resilience, accountability, and the quiet persistence of truth. By remembering these stories, We honor the victims and remind ourselves why vigilance, compassion, and justice still matter. Before we close, I want to ask, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. It's powerful to see how Thomas's story continues to connect us all, even decades after he was lost. These cases aren't just historical footnotes. They're reminders that evil can touch any community, but so can justice. Thank you for watching and for standing with us in the search for truth. If you'd like to see a future video exploring the case of Carol and Doherty, the 1962 murder that may have been connected to Thomas's case, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering Thomas Hernandez. Don't forget to hit that bell icon for our latest stories. Stay safe, take care of your loved ones, and never stop seeking the truth. This has been Cold Case Grim Files. Until next time,